Again, my name is Katerina Cappy, Senior Policy Design Officer at Newham Council, but also coordinating the London Policy and Strategy Network. Really good to see so many people here today. Repeating a bit the house rules, make sure that you are on mute if you're not talking. Today's topic is sociocracy and kind of democratic decision making. That we will be exploring together today. If you haven't already, please put your name, your job title and when you work in the chat so that people can connect, and feel free to ask any questions in the chat as well, but there will be some further opportunities later on to discuss. With that said, I will hand over to Helen, who will be leading today's session. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here today, but I am suffering from savage imposter syndrome because we are literally just learning about this. So I'm just here to show you our learning so far. Bumped into Noel from LPSN, sorry, at the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network meeting a few months back. And he was interested in the concepts of sociocracy and the role of local government, and asked if I was happy to share. So in the spirit of I'm just showing you what I know so far, not an expert, that's what I'm here to do today. So just a little bit about why we're looking at sociocracy as a sort of a method of organising and governing ourselves. And I guess it's come about because we are trying really hard to do better, be more inclusive in our participatory work. And when you do that and you really try and make the effort to do it properly, you kind of realize that we're in a structure that fundamentally isn't conducive to including people in conversations. And so if we're going to do something about that dissonance, we're going to have to think seriously about how our way of being together is structured and organized. And so that gets you thinking deeply about power and hierarchy. And really fortunate in Rochdale to be part of the Greater Manchester City region, where this is a really kind of prevalent theme. And there are various groups who are active in this space right across the system. And it's the parts where those groups are able to kind of get into the ivory towers of local government, which is the bits that we're really interested in. But how difficult it is enlightening in itself. So we've been around like a lot of system change work around Greater Manchester. In particular, I would draw your attention to the work of Lankelly Chase, which is a system change programme that kind of opens up a world of options and possibilities and behaviours about what kind of needs to be done. So we're doing lots of reading and trying to understand the kind of themes that enable us to think deeply and change our behaviour. And the sort of main topics of reading that are happening at the moment are around participatory working, participatory research, doing that properly and robustly, and also the kind of structures, the leadership models, and the compassion or otherwise that's inherent in the system. What we've discovered now is basically we're consciously incompetent. So this is somebody who is holding up their hands, saying we don't know how to do this yet. These are some things that we're trying. So I'm a keen learner at an entry level, and I'm going to show you my workings. So yeah, just to move on to the next slide. When I talk about we, it's probably important for you to know who I'm on about when I'm talking about we. And we've kind of tried to find a way of shifting our understanding about who we are, from the previous kind of very hierarchical models that we've had, which puts the power very much in what's in the bottom left hand corner of this diagram. So the people who are decision makers and leaders and policy makers and commissioners, those are the people who have traditionally had the power to look at information, look at a problem and figure out how to solve it in their image. And in recent years, that started to blend into the people who are subject experts, people who have data at their fingertips, those kinds of things. And then there's been a shift towards involving people from different parts of the community, which is often referred to as like involvement or participatory work or involving people with lived experience. We feel there's a couple of other groups that sometimes can get lost in that process as well, and there's again a dissonance about the extent to which they're able to speak their own truths. So the first group that I draw your attention to are the people who are in front-facing roles. Sometimes they're in statutory roles, so they're almost silenced by the legislation and regulation that sits around the role that they perform. Or they're in commissioned roles, so they might belong to a voluntary sector organisation, and they're silenced because they're commissioned, and you can't, if you take the king's shilling, you can't necessarily call out some of the problems that are in the system. So finding a way of those parts of the system being able to speak their truth is really important. And then there's this kind of blend of people who have lived experience and people who are active citizens. And so there's a bit of a spectrum around that as well, in that many people, it's quite common for people who've been through a thing, who want to come back in as an active citizen to help the system to change. But then also it's true that when people are living it, it's not always the best time for them to call things out that they're experiencing. So often when we talk about people with lived experience, it's a historic experience, and so we need to find ways of engaging that the simultaneity of experience and the people who love and care about a person who's going through something as well. So that in itself is a huge kind of concept, and it's an effort that we're making to try and find ways of involving these groups. And so when we think about who in that way, we suddenly look at the methods that we have and see that they are inadequate. And so this is us seeking a better way. So that's the how. So moving on to the next slide, normally you put your references and reading at the end, but I'm going to put them at the beginning because this is basically what we are studying at the moment. And what follows after this is me summarising a few of the things that are in there. So we'll send these slides out to you, and they've all got links to the places where you can find these things. Some of the content is video, so that first video would be a really good thing if you're interested in the concept of sociocracy and what it is and how it works. The second bullet point is basically everything I know has come from a session with People Support Co-op. There's a person at that organisation called Abby, who in about 3 hours can just open up a whole world of doing things differently and more inclusively. And so I can't recommend a session with Abby highly enough. There's also an array of materials, and again, free content and webinars, and also paid content from a website called Sociocracy for All, which is a community interest company based in the US. We've also been really fortunate to participate in a transformational governance programme, which has a learning community with various materials available to it. And then also there's a Slack space, which is openly available, that's got lots of articles. Yeah, and so yeah, various other things, but I just thought I would just bring those to your attention, because basically spend a few hours doing this stuff and you'll be in the same place as me. And with that in mind, oh, and thanks, yeah, also do share your stuff, because I'm yeah, desperately seeking more. Yeah, brilliant. So moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to tell you a bit about sociocracy, not in a very in any level of detail, just to give you a snapshot of what it actually is, and then there's a breakout session. So while I'm talking through what's in the sort of concept of sociocracy, there is a link right at the beginning of the chat to a PDF document that you can be capturing, because that's your group self-facilitation notes that you're going to be using when you go into breakout groups shortly. So yeah, sociocracy is a system of self-governance, and it's based on 4 principles, and you can do all of these, or combinations of these, elements of these. It works in lots of different ways, and I'll give you some examples of how we've tried to use it. But those 4 principles are everything is done by consent. So you make decisions by consent, you hold meetings by consent, you make decisions by consent. And there's ways of doing that create so much structure and clarity around the way we do things, and so much transparency about how we communicate that with each other. For me, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. There's also some techniques, for example, circle working, which I'll talk to you about briefly, double linking, and elections by consent, as I've already mentioned. And what it is, it's a non-hierarchical way of being that shares power, and it kind of holds it in a very distributed place. And so it is really structured, really transparent and really clear. And it avoids, sometimes when you're thinking about non-hierarchical ways of working, that can sometimes be quite terrifying, especially to local government who have kind of built themselves around power and structure. And the immediate fear is of utter anarchy and what's known as the tyranny of structurelessness. And sociocracy and associated methods really protect from that. This is a risk, a genuine risk. But what it does is it creates power in a really healthy, distributed, shared way. So one of the things you notice when you're working in sociocratic methods is the way meetings are structured. And so the next slide will show you a little bit of what that's like. So you have meetings that are inclusive and they're really, really intentional. So you have agendas that are well prepared and a way of running the meetings that is really familiar. It uses language that everybody understands. It describes projects and pieces of work in the domains that they live and the places that they live. So there's this really clear process. It's pre-agreed and you know exactly what you're letting yourself in for. So there's no more of those experiences. You know, when you're sent in to cover a meeting for somebody, or you're fairly new in a thing and it takes ages to figure out, like, what are we actually doing here? What are the rules of engagement? What's my duty here? What can I bring to the table? All of those kind of uncertainties that we have, and it replaces it with this kind of utter clarity. It's notable that the meetings aren't chaired, they're facilitated, and again there's a methodology to that, so anybody can take on that role. The power doesn't sit with the chair, and everybody gets to speak because of the way that it's managed, if they want to, of course. There are very clear outcomes and assigned actions to people, and what you get as a result is really useful minutes that they don't describe in a load of detail who said what to who. It's about what's useful and what's purposeful and what supports the action. And there's also an ongoing loop of feedback and evaluation, so we can all start to understand how we need to be inclusive with each other. It's quite small on the slide, and you will get a copy of this, but there's 3 parts to the meeting. The first part is an opening round, which includes a check-in, and there's various materials from Sociocracy for All and other places that give you some really great ways of doing check-ins that are dead inclusive, and they don't start with your kind of job title and status. They start with how you are and what you're here for and those kinds of things. There's always a section that's called, in the sociocratic term is admin, which is an acronym for attendance, who's here, duration, what are we here to do, how long are we here to do it for, who's going to do the minutes and how that's going to happen, what information do we need, and we know what's going to happen next. So we start the meeting super clear before we get cracking. Then we look at what's on the table to talk about today, and we consent to that agenda. We agree that that's what we're going to do. And if people aren't in a position to agree that, we understand why, and we understand what they need in order to be able to proceed. And then there's content of the meeting, which comes under 3 possible categories. One is where there's a report, and after so somebody gives a report, puts some input into the meeting, and then we have a round which makes sure that everybody understands what that report is and what its implications are. The second level is where there's something to be explored. So there might be a bit of content and then maybe some thoughts or questions or input that's needed from other people. And the idea of that explore round is that, first of all, we know that everybody understands what's being said and that everybody has an opportunity to share any ideas that they might have that are to do with that thing that's being discussed. And then the most detailed, which takes longer, is the kind of decide approach, which does the first 2 things, but also there's a round where everybody gets to contribute to the decision that gets made. Now, when you're talking in that kind of way, there will be stuff that spins out of that conversation. So it will bring up peripheral issues, it will bring up side issues. And so again, there's a very clear process. So if somebody raises an additional issue, it gets raised, it gets understood and acknowledged, and it goes onto a backlog so that we make sure we don't lose anything, but it doesn't block or prevent us from talking about the thing that we need to talk about. And then we have a closing round, which includes feedback and requests. So that's what the meetings are like. And there's a really good webinar that you can access through Sociocracy for All that kind of takes you through some of the detail of this. It's about an hour and a half worth of time. And then moving on to the next slide is the concept of circle working. So I talked about rounds earlier, and they literally are rounds. And rooms don't always recommend themselves to working in rounds, but I can highly recommend finding places that have actually got round tables because it's impossible not to have that kind of consent behaviour when you're all sat sharing responsibility. But also, obviously, we need to do them on Teams and things, and that's relatively easy because we've got everybody's name or face up on the screen. And so the idea of when you've got a project that's happening is that you've got a kind of coordinating circle, and then you have a series of other circles. And you'll notice on that slide there that there's 2 people from each circle who are in the coordinating circle, and that's a process called double linking. So you don't have one rep that takes and curates all the information and power out of one group into the other. It doesn't follow that hierarchical board structure where there's a sort of feed up process and the numbers of people get fewer and fewer. You create and generate a group of people in the middle. It's quite tricky to work in circles with larger numbers of people, so that means you manage yourself into a way that makes it dynamic and fluid, and it follows the pattern of the work, but it always has this double linking in place. So you can be simultaneously working on several aspects of the same thing, but it's all being coordinated transparently in the middle. And so that's the concepts of circles, and you work in rounds, so you have some content and then everybody gets the opportunity to comment on that or explore ideas as I've described earlier. And so what I'm going to do now is move into giving you just a few examples of how that's worked in our experience so far in Rochdale. And so the next slide is an example of circle working that we're using in our culture sector in Rochdale. So we have a cultural pioneers lab that meets every month on a Friday morning. So the next one is tomorrow. And the Cultural Pioneers Lab is made up of people who are representatives from the different parts of the borough who are working on culture projects, and also other people who are kind of coordinating roles. So I attend that Cultural Pioneers Lab, and it's an absolute joy to attend that lab because, again, we have this clarity. And so we hear about the work that's happening, the development work that's happening in the different areas. We hear about the difficulties, the nuances, the challenges that they're facing in terms of including people. And because of that, it's so easy to make the decisions that we need to make. So a brilliant example of that is that it became very clear very early on that the distribution of funding around culture wasn't fair. It didn't reflect where the need was. We had some parts of the borough that have got more cultural activity and opportunities happening, and some parts of the borough that are there's less happening, there's less resource available, and there's less opportunity for people to be included. And so it was just immediately obvious, we didn't even need to discuss it, that we needed to shift funds from one place to another. And because we're working in this really fair and transparent way, nobody was hoarding wealth, nobody was hoarding power. It was just shared through the middle, out to the sides. And so then it becomes a joy to hear about the stuff that's being done with that resource, and everybody feels part of that process. So yeah, that's an example of how that's working so far using the circles approach and the impact of that. And then moving on, I'm going to give you an example of the inclusive meetings. So this was something that we did a couple of months ago. We held a conference in 2 languages, and we used the inclusive agenda approach for this conference. So there were no PowerPoint presentations and nobody had to prepare. Everybody was a contributor to the conference, and we used rounds based on a really open question to ask people what they thought. And then we developed those rounds into deeper levels of detail until what we were able to produce in in several languages that contributed to a document in English, was almost like a manifesto for action that came directly from that conference. And the group of people were including, very high level academics, national policy makers, practitioners from 2 different European countries, and practitioners from all over the world who've come into the UK. And what you can see on that photograph is the level of listening that was happening because we were doing those rounds. Oh, we also had elected members in the space as well, and it was a little bit out of their comfort zone in terms of the way meetings are normally held, and normally you have somebody opening a conference and telling you about what's going to happen and all of that. And so it was a little bit kind of weird, but what was wonderful was when we embarked on the opening round, watching people kind of move from a position of being a bit like this isn't, I'm here, but it's not really for me, and literally open up, lean into the table and speak with absolute truth about their own experiences and their own passions. And so it quickly accelerated us through a lot of BS, frankly, and got us to what we needed to talk about. So that meant that, something that a conference that probably would have took a full day, people would have got nervous, people would have had imposter syndrome, felt anxiety, all of that just went away just through this process of having this open conversation. And the clarity of outcome was phenomenal in terms of it actually gave us a shared document, a shared manifesto that we could very clearly see the actions that needed to be taken. That resulted in some of the members of that group meeting with the Shadow Minister for Skills to talk about the extent to which national policy helps or hinders adult learning provision in localities. So that's it's called Wissensmacht because that's the kind of power of knowledge. That was the name of the conference. And the final slide I'm going to show you is a piece of work that we're dealing with at the moment, and we are trying to find how do you design a governance structure that's non-hierarchical, and we're currently in the process of trying to figure out a way of doing that. And one of the principles of sociocracy that is really, really helpful is the concept of good enough for now, safe enough to try. So you don't have to decide everything. It doesn't have to be perfect. You've got the psychological safety to fail. You've got the psychological safety to challenge. You've got the psychological safety to learn. And so what that means is that we can try things that might feel different. They might not feel that safe, but it's safe enough, and we can figure out what we need to do by having that clarity and checking in and making sure that everybody has that consent. So before this, I just came from a meeting with our anti-poverty task and finish group, which has just closed itself in order to distribute the power in a more flat way and to place the kind of Lexus of curating the information and presenting it to the Health and Wellbeing Board. It's placed that much more in that central space with those 5 groups involved in it, and the kind of public sector accountability stuff that we're all very used to, that is out towards the side where it needs to be, so it's not getting in the way of the work that needs to be done. So yeah, so that's kind of giving you a bit of a flavour of our work so far. There's much more happening in this space in Rochdale Borough, but also I'm sure there is elsewhere, and I'd love to hear more and read more about what's going on elsewhere. So I think we have a little bit of time if there's any kind of clarification questions, and then we have an opportunity for people to come together in breakout groups.
I think there are some, thank you so much, Helen, first of all. It's really, really interesting to hear. I think there are some questions in the chat. Do you want to take those first? I think, will we have access to the slides? Yeah, we'll send the slides out later on. Perhaps with less kind of comments rather than questions. Yeah, so we've attached the group facilitation notes in the chat as well. But perhaps kind of before going into breakout rooms, I don't know if someone has any questions.
I'd be really interested if anyone here is familiar with sociocracy or has used it in their areas and how that's going.
Anna has a question or raised your hand.
Oh, I was going to say, when I worked at London Borough of Redbridge, I'm at Newham now. I worked in a community hubs team, and they were trying to embed a non-hierarchical structure. We used Björtzorg as our training provider. But it was, yeah, very interesting working in a team that was trying to be non-hierarchical in an organization that was not. And we used a similar model for our team meetings and had rotating roles, which worked really well and definitely felt like a power share. And another thing to note was our one-to-ones were reflection, not direction. So it was a real reflective space, so we could drive the direction of it rather than being outcome or project orientated. So yeah, just wanted to share that, and happy to put you in touch with the manager of that team.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you. I'll stick my email address in the chat. Thank you very much.
I think we have Emily Ahmed next.
Hi. I was just wondering, so I do loads of work in co-production, which I'm sure a lot of people on the call here are kind of aware of or might be working in that same sort of space. And that what you were talking about and this kind of idea of how we restructure it kind of goes along really well with this kind of concepts of power sharing and co-production. The work I do is in health research. And I was just wondering whether you'd seen, or whether in your work, Helen, that had kind of come up, and whether it was bringing those things together, or whether you'd seen them as separate, or just, yeah, just that kind of to question how you'd seen that working together, because it seems like a tool or a way of being able to support that way of kind of challenging power inequalities and health inequity. Yeah, just wanted to ask your thoughts.
Yeah, it's 100% that. So what I was saying at the beginning is we have started doing this work because it's become really clear that the more effort you make into doing proper participatory work, the more you realise the structures that you're in are really not conducive to that happening properly. And there's no real reason for them to be the way they are, other than that is just the way we've kind of inherited. And that is not inclusive, and in many ways could cause more harm than good as a result of that. So yeah, the two go hand in hand. It's really interesting. The session before this one, we were trying to work out what the structure looked like for our anti-poverty work, and the participatory bit we literally could not put into a structure because it's so organic, and if you try and create a structure around it, you're going to exclude, so it has to be messy. And so this structure has to have space to have messy stuff in order to properly hear and listen to what's going on. So yeah, quite how that's going to look, I don't know, but there was mention of things like tendrils and mycelium and stuff, so which is very not what we're used to. But yeah, it fits perfectly with that kind of proper participatory approach. The values absolutely match, and we're a cooperative council in Rochdale, and it fits very much with that kind of cooperative approach, particularly the cooperative value of self-responsibility, which often I think is misunderstood as being like getting people to do stuff for themselves because it's cheaper. But in reality, it says more to the system about how we are when we go into spaces, so that we're taking not just the job that we've got, but we're taking the public servant responsibility with us, and we're taking our personal responsibility with us in terms of getting out of the way, creating space, amplifying people's voices, and hearing what they have to say and making sure doors are opened so that they can say them in the right places. So it really drives that self-responsibility behaviour, which gets me very excited. Yeah, there was a question, what is the difference between holacracy and sociocracy? And there's technical differences, but they're coming from the same kind of value base. And yeah, they're both really interesting, and there's other models as well that are all interesting. My hunch is that we'll find a place in future years where we'll use different methods, and that will be okay because we're not hooked on these hierarchies, and so there'll be more than. And yeah, I don't necessarily think these really long technical sounding names are that useful either, but while we're learning about them in this technical way. So yeah, I think we'll all find our space with that stuff.
I think I don't know if Anna Devi had a question, or you kind of took your hand down again.
Hi, sorry, it was just when you asked if anyone had worked in this way before. So I used to work for a small environmental and anti-oppression charity, which was non-hierarchical, and we worked via consensus decision making. So yeah, just to answer your question.
Yeah, I often, because I've worked in local government for 30 years. And I've worked in Rochdale Council for 30 years, so I know I'm an absolute weirdo in terms of I do not have any other experience of what that's like. And I've heard a number of people talk about how this is fairly normal in the environmental sector and also in food and cooperative sectors. And I often wonder what a culture shock it must be to come into kind of local government space when you're used to power being so well distributed and being so inclusive, and that dissonance that that comes with that is not okay, really. So yeah, it's really important that local government understands how to reach out to people who have that experience and go, how could we do this differently? Because surely there's no good reason to carry on being as we are. Yeah, thanks. There's another hand, I think. Is it Julie?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I was interested in what you had to say about PowerPoint. It's Helen, because
Oh, I think you went on mute, Helen. Oh, Julie, sorry.
I'm on mute. Ah, right, sorry. Yeah, I suppose the clue is in the name, isn't it, really? PowerPoint. But being an academic and being involved in lots of different community groups as well, and having I've also been involved in local authorities in the past. There is quite a reliance on PowerPoint, and I just was interested in that. I sort of picked that up when you said, oh, we don't. There's no place for PowerPoint presentations, and you gave the example of the conference. So I found that fascinating, and just wondered if you had anything to say, Alan, about PowerPoint itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a place for PowerPoint in electronic meetings so that people can see what you're talking about. So for me, they feel less hierarchical in this kind of space than they do when you're in a conference room and there's a massive screen and somebody at a lectern and addressing the group. So yeah, there's just something about that. But yeah, you just don't need them because people are just telling. We all know what we're talking about, so we don't need slides to remind us of that. Because we're using language we all understand, there's no need for complicated diagrams or anything like that. We're just talking about, I think, so the work has been done to create the mutuality of conversation before you come into the space, and so it's quicker and much less irritating, and there's not that experience of people sitting there watching somebody talk about a thing that they have no knowledge of, and it sounds too technical, too bureaucratic for them to feel like they've even got an opinion, and then they're asked for their opinion, as if, now what do you think? It's highly patronizing. And yeah, and so it's doing the work to make you not need it, makes it inclusive, I think, is what I would say. But we're doing some work on kind of trying to call out that sometimes it's patronizing, which isn't nice, but sometimes it's accidentally gaslighting, which is really harmful. And to just make sure that if we're in that bit of the spectrum that's patronizing, that we're not tipping into gaslighting and denying the reality because it doesn't fit with the worldview that's on our PowerPoint slide enshrined in a diagram. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Okay, so you're not saying there's no place for PowerPoint or any other kind of similar sort of system in some things, but in a meeting where there's you're actually looking at being very deliberative about the power sharing and about listening to everybody's voices and people being part of that meeting. There isn't a place for this kind of approach.
Yeah, pretty
Right.
much. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Should we give the breakout rooms a bit of a chance, perhaps? Do you want to just give a brief recap on what we're supposed to be doing in those breakout rooms?
Yeah, Brill. So you should all have access to a PDF that was linked in the chat earlier.
Posting again.
Brilliant, thank you. That gave you 25 minutes, which we've now run over, so it would be 15. Should we say,
Yeah, let's do
should we say
15.
12 to 15? So there's some pointers on there to help you to self-facilitate, and it would be really interesting to hear your experiences based on that when you return back here. So yeah, if we all come back together at maybe 7 minutes to get some feedback, and yeah, is that, or 5 to? Would that be better, Katerina?
Let's do 7 too, and then
Okay.
to give people a minute to actually just come back and
Yeah.
Okay, so 12:53. We'll see you back in here. I'm gonna create rooms. You should be allocated. You'll be allocated as well, I think, Helen. So someone will be happy to have you in that one.
I'm just going to quickly copy and paste the text into the chat, which has been asked for. Just bear with 1 sec.
Yeah, for everyone to make it back
in
into
the
the main
group.
room.
In the big
And
group.
oh, we're back.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good and interesting conversations. Should we do a bit of a feedback, kind of what you talked about, anything you learned, etc. in your group? Should we start in the group with Anna, Debbie, Lizzie, John, Laura, Vanessa? Or anyone else from any group who would like to kind of share what they were talking about. Let's start there instead.
I can start with ours if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, only one of our members had some experience of having done it, and we were more kind of asking, you know, how do you do it? If it's something you can do online, or maybe something you should actually do in person at first to create more trust and things like that. And also if it's something that you can use on a number of things, but maybe not others. So we were just kind of asking a lot of questions around it, really.
Great, thank you so much. Recognizing that we have about 5 minutes left, so yeah, let's keep it short. Room number 2, so Grace, Julie, Cam, and someone called Dee Dee. Anyone willing to, or anyone again from any other group who's kind of would like to share?
Well, in our group, we got to link up with Anne in Sri Lanka and hear all the birds as she had the window open. So that was fantastic.
Oh, wow.
And we just talked about the time, the resource of time, that people need to be prepared to give more time. And that might be quite frustrating for impatient people. But that, as public servants, that's what, you know, we should be prepared to do what works and what works well for the people involved.
Exactly, and I think there's something about if the outcome is better, kind of benefiting residents, then that time will be worth it as well. Any other thoughts or questions?
I think we were talking quite a bit about where there's particularly local authorities, and I was saying I was surprised that there are so many people from local authorities and big organisations, because I was thinking of sociocracy within the context of cooperatives, and it being something that enabled you to listen to different, perhaps sometimes conflicting points of view, and accept that there will be conflict, but there's a way to resolve things. So that's how I came into this, wanting to understand that, and so it was helpful to hear from Helen about the ways of structuring meetings that perhaps allow that to happen. So Yeah, but there was, I think, there was discussion about if you're working in this sort of way within a team, an engagement team or participatory team within a local authority, but the local authority is actually quite a hierarchical, structured organisation. How does that work? Can you have an impact? Can you actually can it affect the rest of the organisation? I suppose that we started to talk about that.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sounds really interesting. Helen, realizing it's 12:58, do you have any kind of closing remarks on anything? Everyone obviously has your email address. We'll be sending out the slides probably by next week. But yeah, any other kind of last comments?
Yeah, thanks so much for joining, and yeah, everything that everybody has said is absolutely true. And yeah, I wonder myself about how it might influence the structures. We're certainly not breaking down those structures in Rochdale. We're trying to work in different ways in parts of that structure. So two of the things that I expect to see the more we do this, as I mentioned in the group I was in earlier, is one, I think we would get more neurodivergent people in leadership roles because of the clarity of meetings and the ability for everybody to have a say. I think it will create more inclusion and diversity in leadership. And yeah, the other thing is it might influence just maybe just the behaviours and the sort of arrogance that's been built into the system but not into the people, and give us permission to not have that arrogance in our structures. So yeah, and we'll keep trying new things, and I'd love to hear more about how it's happening elsewhere. So hopefully I'll see your faces again in other places where we talk about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. I just posted a link in the chat as well. Next week we have a bit of a longer workshop on how to shift power when we work with communities, particularly in community-led research, so peer researchers, citizen-led research project and things like that. So I think that's going to be really amazing and really way to kind of dip your toes into that if you haven't done it. And yeah, understand how we really shift that power, not just kind of asking people to provide us with information about their lives, but actually kind of community-led research and shifting that power. So please join us for that. I'm here if you have any questions as well. I'll put my email in the chat. You have Helen's email, and thank you so much for all your great and interesting thoughts and for attending today. So thank you so much. Big applause to everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.